quer pôr um de cada lado ou não. Pronto. Eu depois abro a bica. Para não dar aquela
Boa tarde. Aqui é.
Good afternoon. Ana Sofia Fernandes asked me to begin, and so I will do. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first event of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. I am not going to introduce the 16 days or today's conference. I think the speakers themselves will delve into these topics, and we will also have the opportunity to discuss broadly the subjects. Allow me to welcome Sofia Ataíde, the representative of the City Council of Lisbon, Councillor for Human Rights, Human Social Rights, Ana Sofia Fernandes, and Ana Catarina Mendes, Deputy Minister of Parliamentary Affairs. I will give the floor now to Sofia Ataíde, speaking on behalf of the Lisbon Town Council. Ana Sofia Fernandes, President of the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights. Greetings, special greetings to the inspiring speakers of today, Mia Doring and Joana Dias. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are celebrating the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Portugal ratified in 1980 the Convention for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and voted for at the UN General Assembly in 1994 for the declaration for the elimination of violence against women. But the truth is that 30 years later, women and young girls are still victims of physical, psychological, sexual violence with immediate and significant devastating impact along their lives. It is urgent to continue to work for the prevention and the fight against all forms of violence together with public entities, private entities, NGOs, and civil society in order to be increasingly effective in this struggle. We need to deconstruct this idea that violence is a private matter of women, enrooted in the cultural heritage that dominates our daily lives. Each and every one of us must play an active role in this deconstruction of the belief and asserting that any form of violence against women and young girls is unacceptable. In 1995, the Town Council appointed the Municipal Council for Equal Opportunities of both men and women, and in 2014, the Municipal Plan for the Prevention and Fight Against Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. This first municipal plan, with a duration of 2014-2017, was a pioneer at national level. It then developed into the Municipal Council for Equality with a broader scope. It is today encompassed of 50 different public and private entities which work in favor of equality. Among them, we have the Portuguese platform for women's rights, in addition to 20 other municipal entities. We now would like to highlight the partnership with CITI, the Commission for Labour and Employment Equality, and other entities in an international project co-financed by the EEA Grants Monetary Fund. All of this work has been acknowledged through the award Living in Equality for the biennials 2016 and 2017, and also for the years 2022 and 2023. We're thus acknowledging the excellence of the municipality in favor of living with equality. At present, Lisbon is the only municipality in Portugal where 3 municipal plans in the area of prevention and the fight against violence against women and domestic and gender-based violence for the equality and against inequality, gender inequality, and the discrimination of LGBTI people. This plan has, and these awards have led to the enhancement of the answers provided to support victims of domestic violence in the municipality. And one of the programs providing housing for victims of violence is an integrated program with a criteria or a special focus on the existence of the statute of a victim. We are well aware that we have still a long way ahead of us, but I wish to congratulate the Portuguese platform for women's rights for the promotion of these meetings. 65 initiatives that have gathered 45 entities around this cause that should engage all of us in the fight against violence. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Sofia.
Thank you very much, Sofia Zaida. Sofia Fernandes. There are many different Sophias here. Good afternoon to you all. Alderman Katia Rosa, my colleagues, and all the associations of women, human rights, assistance to victims, to survivors, NGOs, activists, young people, thank you for being here today. We would like to welcome you as the Portuguese platform for women's rights on this day on the fight against discrimination. We have to continue to mark this day for the bad reasons, and this day has a color, orange. This was set up as a result of a campaign by the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2008, which we celebrate every year because we haven't reached our goal yet. At this stage, we have to do away with violence up to until 2030. Will we get there? Orange stands for hope. Hope in a future free from violence and from fear from violence. And it demonstrates the international solidarity in the struggle against all forms of discrimination and against all the survivors of male violence against women and girls throughout the world. And also in Lisbon, we appeal to the governments, to central power, to local power, to civil society, to women's organizations, youth organizations, the private sector, the media, and everyone to join hands and face this pandemic. This is the true pandemic. Today, the International Day for the Elimination of all forms of discrimination marks the World Campaign of Civil Society, which will be extended until the 10th of December, the International Day of Human Rights, underlining in this way that violence against women is the most frequent violation of human rights throughout the world. The Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights, in close cooperation with the municipality of Lisbon, is launching a program, 16 days for the end of violence against women and girls. This is the opening conference, covers a wide-ranging number of events, debates, conferences, online and offline campaigns, live events, and many stakeholders. We want to state that violence is not a fate. If we come together, we can prevent violence. And in these 16 days, we will deal with all forms of violence, because indeed it's a form of violence that takes on different masks: economic, domestic, sexual violence, sexual trafficking, pornography, online violence that affects a whole generation of youth. Nefarious traditional practices, institutionalized violence, obstetric violence, violence against children and young people, sexual violence based on the the sharing of images without consentment. And we also find intersectional forms of violence with which certain groups of women are faced: migrant women, women without shelter, old women, women who are disabled, who have AIDS, and many other groups. At this time, in an institutional partnership in Lisbon, we will have several monuments that will be lit up in orange. And this symbolically shows the union and the need to occupy the public space with our messages. The Museum of the Navy, the Portuguese Parliament, which for the first time will be lit up, and we have an MP, Dina Lopes. Thank you so much for coming here for the first time. It will be lit up in orange today and on the 10th of December. The Praça do Comércio, this Dom José statue, and we will start marching at 6:30 this evening. And other areas, we've had different images like this spread across the city. This woman represents all women. Dear participants, 5 years ago, the Me Too movement launched a global mobilization and showed the urgency of responding to sex-based violence. Since then, thanks to this movement and many other movements, there has been an ever-growing awareness worldwide. And this has been brought about by the tireless work of activists, defenders of human rights, and the survivors who have demonstrated in public to do away with all forms of violence against women and girls. Thanks to this activism on the field, this work of raising the awareness, like step by step, like little ants, to do away with violence against women, we have to see that today, more than ever, this subject is on the political agenda. We also see that there has been new laws that took effect, and new services were created, and their plans were drawn up. However, we also see that, notwithstanding all these efforts and these growing achievements, and we cannot forget that 22 years ago that the day was set up, 22 years on, we have to see that violence against women and girls continues to be the most pervasive human rights violation in the world. It affects more than 1 in each 3 women, and this number remains constant over the past 10 years. The recent world estimates show that on average 1 woman or girl is killed by somebody in her own family every 11 minutes. The pandemic of COVID increased violence, but it also exposed and exacerbated deep inequalities, structural inequalities, and meant that the clock was turned back in terms of women's rights. The number of women in extreme poverty went up. The load of care, of not unpaid care and domestic work went up, which are all factors which worsen the risk factors which give rise to violence against women and girls globally. The climate change and global conflict and economic instability are factors that can make everything worse, make the scourge even worse. Also, in today's reality, we acknowledge something which deeply concerns us all. Globally, there has been an upsurge in the movement's anti-rights, rights of women's organizations and feminist rights, which mean that there's an ever more restricted area for civil society movements against and attacks to women who defend women's rights and activists worldwide. In many countries, even in Europe, we see that the clock is turning back. Even the withdrawal of the Istanbul Convention, which is our golden standard for the work, and the European Union has not been able to ratify it because there's no consensus. In other countries, regressive laws were approved that increase impunity for the aggressors, and there has been the use of force by several governments to silence what we call femicide. In some countries, women's organizations have lost their legal status. We live in a world full of contradictions. I'll bring yet another one. Despite these worrying trends, it's very clear, it's clearer than ever, that violence against women and girls is avoidable. Facts, analysis, studies conducted show that the existence of a strong autonomous feminist movement is the most critical factor to lead to drawing up policies to do away with discrimination against women and girls transnationally, nationally, and locally, and therefore an appeal to reinforce investment in building the women's movements. Research has also shown that drastic drops in violence can occur by means of coordinated multi-sectorial actions of governments and civil society and intensive efforts to raise the awareness and campaigns such as those which were done by feminist movements in the media. Dear participants, I don't want to go on forever, but at the beginning of these 16 days of activism here in Lisbon, we would like to invite you all to be activists in preventing violence against women and girls, which is a slogan in 2022 of the campaign of the Secretary General of the United Nations. By taking a public stand, by participating in all events you possibly can, raising the awareness of other people so that they too can participate, raising the awareness of those around us, our communities. We also invite you to mobilize yourselves so as to avoid the turning back of women's progress. We want to amplify women's voices in these various movements. We want an ever-growing support, a more effective support, long-term support, sustainable and flexible support to the organizations by governments, be it at central, local level, foundations, other donors, for the organizations who are based on human rights, which were ratified by the Portuguese state, and these can be invoked in court. We appeal to the defense and strengthening of the mechanisms of protection to eliminate violence, harassment, threats, intimidation, discrimination against women who defend women's rights in line with these reference frameworks. We want to promote leadership, feminine leadership, and their participation in public areas in drawing up policies at local and national level. We honor the women's movements and their leadership in the 16 days of activism which are going on in the world ever since 2008. In this process, we don't want to leave anybody behind. We have to have an approach based on human rights, focused on the particular attention to certain groups of women and girls who are in a less favorable position, who face greater hardships, and who lie at the intersection of various forms of discrimination. Finally, 2 key messages for these 16 days. We have to give voices to the survivors, those who were victims one day and now who are allies in Tolerance Zero as regards the end of violence, and to give voice to the young feminists who today are building their future. We all have a role to play, individuals, institutions, and we have to work together and across the board. Because, and the studies show this, violence is avoidable. We have to make this happen, and we invite you to participate in the 16 days. The program is in the site endofviolence.pt. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigada a ambas. Eu começava por fazer uma pergunta.
Allow me to start by asking a question to Sofia Tietê from the Lisbon Town Council. Of course, human rights, as Sofia Fernandes highlighted, of all human rights, gender-based violence is an attempt against human rights. So women represent half of the world's population, although we are often treated as a minority. However, it's not only a question of human rights. Prevention and policies against gender-based violence are linked to other entitlements, public safety issues, homeless policies, because homeless women are more vulnerable than men, homeless men. Strategies for leaving prostitution, so several policies that lie in addition to human rights. So I'd like to know what is the municipality's approach to this, all of these policies that cut across human rights.
Penso que já estou com som. Estou. Boa tarde a todos mais uma vez.
Good afternoon once again. To your question, and you said cross-cutting. Of course, there must be somebody in the town council, somebody who is in charge of establishing all protocols, arrangements to ensure that we are here to help, to support. Now, quite personally, if you ask me, this situation is a big concern, and it is very close to me because 20 years ago, in 2002, I worked for APAV. I was working with APAV at the back of the room, where I carried out my internship and where I finished my PhD project. So this topic is very dear to me. And all councillors here have joined efforts in this fight against violence, be it against women, young girls, or any gender, actually. Violence is something we don't want. And of course, nobody cannot be not against. So yes, violence is a topic which we will continue to work for. Sofia Fernandes, you said, or you mentioned many forms of violence against women. Sexual violence, domestic violence, femicides, beatings. That is very graphic, and we are all shocked. And there is no sign, unfortunately, that the number of cases are decreasing. So violence, objectification in pornography, a myriad of acts of forms of violence that exist. And since this is what you do, what are the priorities? Because we despair when we look at the scenario that doesn't change. So I would ask you to please highlight the priorities, because we have a member of parliament here who is particularly interested in these topics, and PPDM is almost a banner of women's rights in Portugal. What are the priorities that you think we should target? Is it justice? Is it researcher training? Is it judges so that they stop pronouncing the decisions which are an attempt against women's rights? But all of these produce effects in the long term or in the medium term. What do you suggest that we do right away? Well, violence is the cause and consequence of inequality between men and women. Violence is a phenomenon that results from structural dominance in society of women by men. So, if we do not target the root of the problem, we may have many prevention campaigns, but they will not produce the effects, the intended effects. Women increasingly report, and very well so, because we have been working hard at this level. The question is the system able to respond adequately? The system, in turn, is composed of people with their own stereotypes and preconceived ideas, and they often reproduce the same type of response. So prevention and education is essential, which is focused on deconstructing the relations of power that dominate in our society. Furthermore, and in my view, this is something that is essential and is part of the global campaign this year. Autonomous services, women's organizations, the stronger they are critical for changing global trends. Public funds should be also predictable and adjusted to needs, which is not often the case. We have associations that are specialized and are constantly submitting applications for funding while they should be focused on the work, the purpose of their existence. Violence also has an economic cost for the government and for organizations themselves. The organizations don't have that many people. These people should be working on the field, on the ground, which they have been trained for, instead of spending time submitting applications for funding. And sometimes they receive their own income from those funds, and sometimes the funds end and they are without a job. So it's in the interest of the government in general, of all of us, that financing be part of the state budget so that it may be foreseeable, regular. Otherwise, we are exhausting our energy. We are not being efficient. We need to rethink also the way we work at this level as well. So to act on the causes of inequality and support feminist and women's rights institutions. Excellent recipe in my view. I will now give the floor to Maria Sepúlveda, who has a message from Engenheiro António Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, who supports this initiative as well.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank this opportunity to speak. It's an honor to read the message of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I'll do this in the best possible way. And I feel a bit nervous. Violence against women and girls is the most pervasive human rights violation in the world. Every 11 minutes, a woman or girl is killed by an intimate partner or family member. And we know that other stresses, from COVID-19 to economic turmoil, inevitably lead to more physical and verbal abuse. Women and girls also face rampant online violence, from misogynistic hate speech to sexual harassment to image abuse and grooming by predators. Discrimination, violence, and abuse targeting half of mankind comes at a steep cost. It limits women's and girls' participation in all walks of life, denies their basic rights and freedoms, and blocks the equal economic recovery as well as the sustainable growth that our world needs. Now is the time for transformational action that will end violence against women and girls. This requires that governments have to design, fund, and implement national action plans to tackle the scourge. It means involving grassroots and civil society groups at every stage of decision-making. It means ensuring that laws are implemented and respected so that survivors see their rights to justice and support upheld. It means supporting public campaigns that challenge patriarchal norms and reject misogyny and violence. And as we are reminded by this year's theme, Unite, Activism to End Violence Against Women and Girls, it means standing together with activists worldwide who are calling for change and supporting survivors of violence, It calls on governments to increase funding by 50% to women's rights organizations and movements by 2026. Let us take a stand and raise our voice in support of women's rights. Let us proudly declare we are all feminists. Let's consign violence against women and girls to the history books. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Maria.
Thank you very much, Maria. This was a wonderful interpretation of the message. You were not at all nervous. Now we will listen to a message which was sent to us by the Minister, Ana Catarina Mendes.
Quero começar por agradecer.
I'd like to thank the invitation of the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights to participate in the 16 days of activism as regards the end of violence towards women and girls. Unfortunately, I cannot be in person with you today, but I do want to contribute with my words to this first event. These will be 2 weeks of intense activism, which are added to the constant and daily activism that we hope will bring together everybody in favor of a cause which deserves our attention and our action daily. We have to refer the developments in the protection of the victims of domestic violence in Portugal. In 2015, 55% of the country had a national network to support the victims, but today the cover of this network is 95%. The country now has 200 structures to give assistance to families which have domestic violence, 26 units for hosting emergency cases, 35 shelters, and 28 psychological support units. We have specialized our responses by helping violence that is not linked to LGBTI, and also we have a shelter for women that are disabled, and we have another one for women who have mental health issues, and we are now preparing shelters for elderly people and people who are victims of domestic violence. Now we want to continue to work in the psychological support to the victims, including children and young people, based on trauma-focused approaches. We want to invest in creating materials and information campaigns, breaking stereotypes and preconceived ideas. We all have to continue, all of us, to continue engaged in this combat to all forms of violence against women, promoting gender equality, because only in this way will we contribute to more inclusive and happier societies. This is an ongoing struggle that we have to wage every day. These 16 days of activism will culminate on the 10th of December, the International Day of Human Rights, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1948. We hope that in 2022 we can celebrate the victories and work to remove the obstacles in these 16 days and throughout the year, every day, every year. You can count on me on this path because we are really speaking about human rights. I wish you very good work and very good initiatives. Thank you.
Eu sugeria mais uma salva de palmas para
I would ask for another round of applause for Ana Sofia Fernandes, Ana Catarina Mendes, Sofia Taide. And now moving on to the next stage of our conference, I ask Mia Doring and Joana Dias to please come and sit up here next to us.
It's your turn, Mia. A Mia Doring e a Joana.
Mia Doring and Joana Dias are 2 survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, sexual exploitation, and they are here to share with us their experience. Thank you so much for taking part in this conference. Mia, would you like to take the stage?
A little bit about your life story. microphone over there.
Is this okay? Muito obrigado. Bello. Convite. Was that good? Thanks. I'm an author and activist and a psychotherapist. I specialise in sexual trauma. And I've been involved in the abolitionist movement in Ireland for the last 10 years, during which we introduced the Nordic model of sex trade legislation, or it's also called the equality model, which decriminalises the person who sells sex and criminalises the person who purchases it. And I published my memoir, Any Girl, a memoir of surviving prostitution in Ireland earlier this year. And it is my life mission to have paying for sex to be seen as the sex crime it is. Just to give some context to my story, I was raped when I was 16 in a local park by another teenager, and I didn't tell anybody. The year after that was just a terrible time. My world was completely ripped apart. I was so lonely, isolated, and traumatized. Shortly after being raped, a man who was around 35 years old came into my life and groomed me into the sex trade. He did this by texting me via my phone. He spent about a year grooming me, texting me what he wanted from me. He was interested in the whole schoolgirl thing, humiliation, domination. He was incredibly controlling. The attention on me as a valuable sexual being felt intoxicating and powerful. I felt important. My sexuality had never gotten a chance to be anything because I'd never had sex before I got raped. This attention felt like it was, in a really weird way, restoring it. Eventually I met him, this guy, and the first time, I'm not going to go into what happened, but when I was leaving the house, he gave me £100 and he said, "Here is some pocket money." So in that moment, money for the use of my body became tangible evidence of my self-worth, of feeling valued. Then he spent 3 years, roughly, taking me to different hotels, doing things to me, taking photographs, videos, and so on, paying me £100 every time. We never spoke about the money. It was always waiting in the bathroom on top of the school. He made me wear this like school uniform thing. So this like pornified school uniform. So he would leave the money on top of it. We never talked about it. Then, when I was about 19, he sent me to a friend of his in a hotel. This friend was an elderly man. And there was something about this experience, it being a job with a time and 1 hour to be at this hotel at this time for this amount of money, that clicked something in me as this is a job I can do. This old man was incredibly violent and abusive, and something else clicked in me, that I was capable of enduring this level of violence and humiliation. I eventually escaped from the abuser, the other guy, the abuser guy, but the trauma from rape was obviously unresolved and was now compounded on by the abuse, and I was further traumatized, and I was still left with the need to feel that my sexuality was wanted and valuable, which the money represented. So I voluntarily chose to enter the sex trade. I know it sounds crazy, but it makes sense. I still have shame around this choice. So I have no memory of researching it, of making an ad online. I have it all blocked out completely. It's a mystery to me how I did any of it. I have no memory of the first puntiero. Is that the word? I remember fragments of the 4 years I spent in the Irish sex trade. I went to hotel rooms and houses and apartments all around Dublin. My story seems quite dramatic, but in reality it was not dramatic. It was nearly boring. I was so incredibly disconnected from my body that anything happening to it felt insignificant. For the first time, it felt like I got to feel like I was setting the terms and conditions over what happened to my body. It felt powerful to have a fee and a time limit, to feel as though I was in charge over what happened. This is called reenacting trauma. where we unconsciously seek out similar patterns in order to right the previous wrongs. I was about 21, and most of the men were in their 40s, 50s, 60s, married, middle class, with money to spend. They were just ordinary, everyday men. They were entitled, treated me like a plaything, were demanding, would haggle, some were violent, but because they paid to use my body how they wanted, the contract of being paid meant that I was under pressure to do the job how they wanted. I was also under pressure to be as friendly and pleasing as possible, but there was always a feeling of threat under the surface. You had to make them happy. Think about how vulnerable you are in a room with a man. Many of them would offer an extra €50 for types of sex that would be uncomfortable or painful. They write reviews for the women on the escort websites. They give stars out of 5, so like 2 stars out of 5 for appearance, satisfaction, and value for money. Mostly my experience in prostitution was disgusting, but this is what I thought I deserved when it came to my sexuality, so I repressed the disgust. I created a persona and identity separate from my college-going, art-making self. I identified with the punters as my allies in this world. Every time I had sex I didn't want, which was every time, I split further from myself to cope, one traumatized self absorbing the pain and reenacting the trauma, and another normal self that was going to college and doing whatever I was doing and was able to function. If I didn't have the other self, I would have had to face and feel everything that had happened to me, and I wasn't able to do that. Recovery is bringing these two parts together and integrating the pain and processing the pain, the helplessness, the lack of justice, and the absolute fear, which I just suck down every time. It's a process that I still work with every day. I was operating totally in my head, where there was no harm if I was agreeing to it and ignoring any messages my body tried to send me. So I would be anxious and scared before meeting a punter. My stomach would be sick. I would be completely dissociated during the entire sexual encounter. But in my head, it was fine. I was getting paid. I consented. So I continued. When I was around 24, I met a particularly violent punter who treated me like I was a piece of machinery. He hit me and he tried to rape me. And my body was so broken after that experience that I couldn't ignore it any longer, and that was the end. I look back and I am shocked at the experiences I had, at the level of trauma I was operating under, how disconnected I was from myself. But more than that, I am shocked at the behavior of these grown adult men who used my 22-year-old body the way they wanted, who paid me to put my feelings, my wants, my pain and discomfort to one side for their sexual gratification. This is rape culture, so that is rape. They paid so they wouldn't have to bother with obtaining actual, mutual, authentic, enthusiastic consent. So I say that I was voluntarily raped for 4 years, and I was reviewed online about how well I faked enjoyment of that. There are some barriers to us understanding prostitution as abuse. The first one I would say is a lack of understanding about the term consent, sexual consent. So the word consent means to comply, to say yes. It does not mean to desire. It does not mean enthusiastic. It does not mean communication. But these are all the descriptions that I hear of sexual consent. To consent just means to say yes. It does not include why you're saying yes. So we have conversations about sex that are like, make sure you get consent and make sure you give and get consent. So in this context, sexual consent is a contract of giving and getting, saying yes or no. The discussion is surface level engagement on something much more complex than that. And violation is inherent in the act of being paid to acquiesce to sex. Paid consent renders that consent void. It's gone. There is no consent if you have to pay somebody to say yes. It's an oxymoron, or I don't know what the word is. You know what I mean? A paradox? I don't Without mutuality, which can only exist freely, there is only violation. And sex trade sex isn't mutual, that's why it's harmful. It doesn't matter how we think about it or how we talk about it or what language we use about it. It's not mutual, so it's not consent. It is in rape because you consented, but it isn't mutual. The men know that. Seconds after meeting you, the man decides what position to put you in, how fast and for how long he's going to be inside you, because he is the king for that half an hour. And I don't understand how that isn't part of our rape culture conversations. If you have to compromise your sexual safeness, you have no option but to dissociate. This compounds the trauma because there's no safe reconnecting available. The punter is not going to say, "You've gone rigid and you look spaced out. Are you okay?" Because a dissociated escort is the perfect escort because she has no feelings, no wants, no desires, and no boundaries. Instead of consent, maybe we should start using the term mutuality, which is not about giving or getting. Mutuality is equality. It puts us as equals in our sexual undertaking. Where we don't have mutuality, we only have violation. And it doesn't, like I said already, it doesn't matter what we say, what language we use about this. The body absorbs unwanted sex. Whether or not we're saying, yes, I want to do this, or it's worth it for €100 or whatever, the body experiences the truth, it knows it, it holds it to come out later, when or if it's safer. So the people who defend prostitution will never talk about what actually happens in the room with a punter because it would show us exactly how not mutual it is. They also won't talk about the reviews the men write for the women because it's so obvious that the men understand perfectly well that sexual consent is not present. For the men, paying money to compensate the woman wipes away any wrongdoing. It wipes away their conscience. Here's a quote from a punter, which I think encapsulates all of them. "I must get the impression that my pleasure is important to her and that she isn't just trying to get through the appointment. The reality may be quite different, but the impression she gives me is what counts." They don't care. I can't tell you how strongly they don't care about what's going on for the woman. They don't care. I don't care what you've heard. They don't care about the women. Another barrier in the way of us seeing prostitution as sexual abuse is cultural messaging, often from people and organizations who call themselves feminists. I'm going to keep this a little bit short because I'm aware of the time. When you tell your story of trauma within prostitution, you will be victim blamed 100,000 times worse than if you come out and tell a story of rape. Because you accepted money for your abuse, you accepted compensation. The people who want prostitution to be normalized say that it was just a job that didn't suit you, that you weren't strong enough for it. But all that is needed to work in the sex trade is a vagina and a mouth. And sex is the easiest thing in the world. It's pleasurable, right? So why do you have to be mentally strong to do it? But they don't answer these questions. They say sex work is work. Having a penis inside your body is a service like any other service, like making coffee for somebody in a coffee shop. They say that the sexual power imbalance in prostitution is like any other workplace power imbalance with an employer and an employee. They don't mention the age discrepancy between 20-year-old women and 50-year-old men. But it's all they talk about when it comes to the Me Too movement. But in prostitution, suddenly it's okay. They turn male sexual entitlement to vulnerable women's bodies into consumer behavior. So pimps are called managers, agents, or fellow sex workers. They say no one likes going to work. I mean, I like going to work as a therapist. I'm sure plenty of us enjoy going to work. It's ridiculous. They want it to be mysterious and vague. They want it to have a veneer of acceptability. So they use terms like high class, escort, sex worker, and minor sex worker to talk about a child being raped. I'm going to skip this a little bit because it's quite long. Sorry, it's just a little bit too long. They changed the language we use to describe the reality, but the reality hasn't changed at all, just how we're thinking about it. So it's like cognitive gymnastics. Do you know what I mean? It's like twisting us around so we're thinking differently about it, but the reality is exactly the same. Another barrier, Sorry, I'm going to skip that big long thing. Another barrier to us understanding prostitution as sexual abuse is not focusing on the men. So in Ireland, my country, there are about 1,000 women or so who sell sex, who are involved in the sex trade. And over 100,000 Irish men pay for sex, so that's 1 in 15. The discrepancy is stark, 1,000, 100,000. And so is the discrepancy of where we put our attention. And when we talk about prostitution, we talk about women's choices all the time. How did she get into it? How did she get out of it? Who was the worst punter? Were there any nice punters? Like the usual questions. And we talk about prevention, how to stop women getting involved in it. As usual, when it is about men's sexual crimes, our focus is totally on the woman. I wonder what it would be like if we shifted our awareness to the 100,000 men. I wonder what impact it would have if, when we're talking about prostitution, we ask them how they got into the sex trade. How did they end up paying for sex? Sorry. Why they pay women to say yes to have sex with them. Imagine their answers. Ask them why they go online afterwards and write reviews of how well the woman faked sexual enthusiasm. Why did they give 2 stars out of 5 for that woman and 5 stars out of 5 for that woman? Why do they think they have a right to a woman's body for any reason? The answers would be mortifying for the men. It is mortifying that men pay for sexual access. It's mortifying for them that they cannot connect with a woman enough for her to want to have sex with him. Here are some quotes from their reviews. She provided good service, nice body, but had no English at all. Totally useless, crap at her job. She does an unwrapped blowjob, so that's a blowjob without a condom, but not long before resorting to hands. She claimed I was too big when I asked for anal, but it's on her favorites. A favorite is like the list of things the woman will do. The only chat we had was Google Translate to negotiate business. Imagine having sex where you can't communicate what's happening for you to the person who's having sex with you because you don't have any English. And then they write reviews about this. This is how they think. Female vulnerability, like addiction and poverty, is not the root cause of the sex trade. Men in addiction or poverty or just out of a care system don't end up in prostitution. Male sexual entitlement is the root cause. Men are the root cause, all men. As long as we are mostly focusing on the issues affecting women's choices, the men, who are the ones who sustain and maintain the sex trade, can continue hiding in their cloak of invisibility. Change needs to be a male-led action. Men have got to be leaders on this and stop leaving it up to women, because that perpetuates the comfortable concept that male violence is a women's problem, when of course it is a men's significant problem with women. Men must simultaneously hold both of these truths, hold and express both of these truths. I am complicit and also not in my name at the same time. People don't know that sex trade reviews exist. People need to be shown the reality of men's behaviors. They are not punters or clients or sex buyers or customers. They are sex offenders. They're perpetrators. They're rapists. And in any country, the laws around prostitution have to reflect that by criminalizing their behavior. So I'm nearly finished. So the hardest part, just to come to we're nearly finished. The hardest part of all this for me is that I colluded with the punters in violating myself. And after realizing that I had been willingly raped over and over again for 4 years, my trust in myself felt contaminated and filled with shame. It undermines every part of my life. It undermines everything I would like for myself, because I don't trust myself to know what's best for me. Far worse than any intrusive memories or depression or whatever else is the sense that I am the site of danger for me. I know cognitively that I didn't do this to myself. I understand. I got raped, I got groomed, I reenacted trauma in the sex trade. In my head, I understand all this. But it feels like I did it to myself, because I consented and I got paid for it, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. What I am left with is a deep fear that I can't trust men and can't trust myself to keep myself safe in relation to men. I don't trust them not to have a secret violent misogyny that I won't realize until it's too late, because I know how easily they can move through the world undetected. I can't tell you how ordinary these men are, how normal they are, and they're in all of our lives. They're ordinary men. They're not monsters, they're ordinary. Some of them were very friendly, I liked some of them, despite what they were doing. What I am left with, oh, sorry about that. Yes, I know how easily they can move through the world undetected, and I haven't been in a relationship for nearly 10 years because of this. I'm 39. I'd like to have a family, but I don't trust myself to know where the danger is, and I don't want other young women experiencing what I did and having a delayed life while they're trying to live with their trauma. I spent 10 years totally lost, trying to do loads of activism, doing anything but actually facing into what happened to me. I've made a good life, but the grey landscape of abuse is always in the background, as anyone here who has been abused understands very well. Sexual trauma is never in the past, it's here in the present. It has a domino effect on the kind of society we have. And men paying for sexual access is damaging far beyond the individual women involved, but all women everywhere, girls and boys. It affects how men see and treat women across all classes and strata of society. It is the embodiment of rape culture, and we have to fight it. And the messages young people are getting of sex work as work and so on. Either it's acceptable to rate women out of stars out of five out of stars out of 5, or it isn't. Either it's acceptable to objectify women's bodies, or it isn't. It's a human rights abuse, and it needs to end. So I just wanted to read really quickly just the end of one of these chapters. So because sexist attitudes have been ingrained in our culture for centuries, I cannot imagine what a world without them would look like. I close my eyes and see nothingness, a place razed to the ground. Someday when I am long dead, our successors will look back with horror that the sex trade, strip clubs, and pornography ever existed, that we once treated women in that way, just as we look back on the recent history of rape being legal within marriage, of the Magdalene laundries, of the marriage bar, of women not being allowed to vote or pursue an education. There will be museums, and people will shake their heads in dismay. I want to imagine that world. I imagine how safe women would feel, how they could trust the world. I imagine how therapeutic it would be for them to feel a sense of justice, to know that our history of oppression is explicitly condemned. A world where girls grow up to discover their sexuality on their own terms, not from how pornography depicts them or from how porn-infused boys treat them. Sexualities develop naturally in their own time and in their own way, with moments of connection and exploration. I imagine a world where women feel the right to safety in their bones, where women's suffering at the hands of men is not taken as an unfortunate, tragic, unpreventable norm. In this world, misogyny doesn't get a chance to develop. Women are respected sexually and in every way. Women are released from the stranglehold of needing to be likable and easygoing and not too much, because no such messaging to mute or contain ourselves exists. Women do not resign themselves to unnecessary pain, humiliation, and competition with other women for the resources over which men hold power. Women are trusted and believed in relation to their medical issues. Their pain is no longer discounted or sidelined. Angry and loud women are accepted without judgment. Girls don't get raped, catcalled, or groomed. If there is a sexual predator or murderer at large, women won't be told not to walk home alone after dark. Instead, men will be given a curfew and will accept this with understanding. Men don't review women on sex trade websites because sex trade websites don't exist. I know that this world is idealistic, and maybe I am naive to try to imagine it, and I can't imagine it, but I know that the air there is clean, and I imagine myself breathing in this clean air. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Mia, thank you so much for your testimony. It was really moving and, well, enlightening. Joana, queres também contar-nos a tua história?
Your history or your story.
Boa tarde.
Good afternoon. My name is Joana. I'm 45 years old. I was a victim of domestic violence. And I'm here today. I'm nervous because I'm speaking in public. My voice is trembling, my legs are trembling, but I feel safe. There were years in my life where I lived very nervous all the time, with my head and heart always in a turmoil, where I was not able to make my voice be heard. I was not safe, nor was I able to defend myself. I felt I had lost my expression. In front of me, I have a community that can protect me. And this is why the nerves I feel today do not prevent me from making my voice be heard. I'm no longer afraid. On average, of 1 in each 3 women is the victim of violence. We speak about domestic violence, physical violence, psychological, sexual, verbal, emotional, moral, patriarchal, and other forms of violence and aggression. Closed in their homes, women who are victims of domestic violence need to know that the community is on their side, beginning with their families if they're lucky, and I was lucky. And then going on to politicians, the judicial world, the law enforcement forces, and education. Some months ago, I was in a school talking with teenagers on violence during dating. At the end, a group of girls came up to me, and one of them was crying. And she asked me whether it was normal for her boyfriend not to let her have boyfriends, other friends who are men. Whether it was normal for him to read her messages in her phone, whether it was normal for her to press her to send him photographs naked, whether it was normal to feel anguish every day with fearing him. She trembled when she told me that she felt guilty whenever he got upset. I asked her why she continued to be with him, and her answer was, because I love him and because he loves me. And this love has a lot. It's a very complicated thing. She's 16 years old, and I was 35. And nobody's free from having this happen to him, to her. Domestic violence does not pick ages or color of the skin or religion or social class or banking account. From the data available, domestic violence only chooses women. To combat the misogynist societies that is homophobic and macho society in which we still live, we need to educate for equality, for respect of genders, whichever they may be. And it is here that we begin with education. We have to educate our children and do everything within our reach so that the future generations will not bring with them sexist vices. It's mandatory that we should stop telling our children that strength is for boys and delicacy is for girls. And we have to stop telling boys that they look like girls when they cry, and girls that playing football is a boys' game. It's mandatory to teach our children that love means freedom and not prison. Do these seem like details? They are not. In these ages, when people are still children, that gaps between the genders start to be dug, and the idea that there has been there has to be somebody on top and somebody on bottom. If school teaches us how to read, to write, and arithmetic, how is it possible that there isn't a discipline that will teach us to understand and be able to interpret our emotions and the emotions of other people? From the 5th year, we have citizenship in schools that touches on these issues if it is properly taught. But 6 months of citizenship per year is not sufficient. This discipline has to have more hours, more expression, more credit. It must be as important as Portuguese or mathematics in the school curriculum, and should be extended to elementary school and even to kindergarten. The school must play a key role in setting up the basis to learn to deal with emotions, and it must be the school, because many families are not able to do this, to teach our children to deal with sadness, anger, and frustration, to teach them to cultivate empathy to teach them that to love is above all to respect and to be respected. That is surely an investment in good mental health and the emotional health of our future adults. And to have mental health will prevent abusive behaviors, toxic and violent behaviors. I know that the school does a lot, but it must do more. Rational intelligence only works and is only balanced when it goes hand in hand with emotional intelligence. I ask you, how is it possible that at the beginning of 2023, this discipline does not yet exist together with mathematics, Portuguese, science, which deals with emotional intelligence with our children? How is this possible? And that teaches girls and boys, men and women, and all agendas, that we are all equal in our rights and our freedoms. In our society, woman is seen as an inferior, weaker gender, dependent on men with a servile role.
Remonta a séculos.
And this dates back to centuries. Patriarchal societies are oppressing, and they set the bad example, which toxic machismo uses to justify its acts and decisions. Until when are we going to live in a country where women and men, where women, says the speaker, earn less than men in similar roles, where women who dedicate their life to care for their children and houses have to be dependent financially on their husbands? A country where women are always sexually harassed. I'd like to ask the men who are here, and there are few, but there are some, how often have you asked yourselves when you leave the house, does my shirt have a cleavage? Do I have to cover my legs more? Do I need to hide my body? And I'd like to ask the same to the women around in this room. How many times have you thought about this every day? Women and girls are targets, and this fosters violence inside and outside the house and explains the frightening numbers of violence against them, against us. Specifically speaking about domestic violence, I remember how difficult it was for me to complain against my aggressor, and something that the policeman to whom I told my story told me. He said, if we caught him in flagrant, it would be far easier. This sentence was said time and time again by a commander of the police force in a television show where a group of people were invited, including me, to understand how we can do away with domestic violence. If domestic violence has a number of possible aggressions, I'd like to ask the politicians, the judicial system, the law enforcement forces, how can you catch the aggressor in flagrant when a woman is raped within her own home? This happened to me, and the last thing I thought was to ask for help using my mobile phone. If the black marks and the scars in one's body are visible to the eyes, how can a victim explain the unseen black marks, those which are not visible, those that were provoked by years or months or even a whole lifetime exposed to manipulation, lies, persecution, violence, blackmail? I often went to the police force and I was never received by a woman, ever. I always spoke with men, and one of them who had experience of years with victims and aggressors said that my aggressor did what he did out of love. He asked me if I didn't think about forgiving him and going back to him. Does this seem strange? It does, but it happened. I'm fully aware that not all men are machistic and toxic. Fortunately, there are many men who are feminists, but Machismo and feminism are not in the opposite ends. The first must be done away with. Feminism is something that is necessary, that must be maintained, because it protects us all, both men and women. But in terms of the law and order forces, the lack of women is striking. And I ask you why? What is the representativeness within the public forces, law and order forces? How many policemen, LGBTI, exist? How many non-white policemen exist? How many policemen or women from other ethnic groups exist? How many women exist? We have to have balance in the representation within the law enforcement forces. This is not the current situation, and what measures can be taken to solve the problem? The way in which the victim of domestic violence is received when she lodges a complaint against the aggressor makes a huge difference. The victim must feel that she has arrived at a safe place, irrespective of her age, her gender, her religion, her physical appearance, the country where she comes from, and so on and so forth. Have you thought about the number of barriers that a woman has to overcome to go to a police station, complain of the man who oppresses her, who hits her, and who takes away her freedom? Can you imagine the weight of guilt and fear and shame? Have you thought about the courage you have to have when, after lodging a complaint against an aggressor, you have to go back on your own and waiting for the police to do something and judicial system to do something is a very solitary journey. Perhaps it would be easier for some women, says the speaker, who have been the victims of domestic violence to be received by somebody who they can feel as a peer and not by somebody who represents the aggressing gender. The first time I made a complaint, after I became separated, I asked the policeman who received me who would protect me when my aggressor found out, and the answer was clear. In the immediate, nobody. I was told that I should leave my house and go to a shelter house. I refused to leave my house, which was my refuge, would remove the little structure I still had. In truth, I'm very much anguished by knowing that the only solutions given to the victim are that of running away or disappearing, whilst the aggressor continues to go about his business as if nothing had happened. It's also anguishing the number of times that the victim has to tell her story when she goes to the authorities for help, and she has to go through all the different stages of the procedure. She has to relive and recall and verbalize time after time everything that she went through. Is deeply disturbing and increases fear and despair. It's pressing to help the liberation, the release of this fear and despair, and not stoke it. And this brings me to the media and the way in which the information on the reality of domestic violence reaches our homes. As important as saying how many women die, you have to say how many women are saved when the aggressors go to prison, and what is the sentence that is given to them. In this way, you remove the strength from the aggressor and you empower the victims. If I live in a reality of domestic violence and I have to deal with constant information of the death of yet another woman at the hands of her husband or boyfriend, I become weaker. I lose my security, my hope. I will be a prisoner of my silence. If I am a victim of domestic violence and the media may publish news on women who have become free, who solve their problems, who tell us that the aggressors have gone to prison, that they are doing time, and they have psychological supports which they need, I become stronger. I will I'll be more secure. I will be more confident, more able to make my voice heard. So I'd like to give this note. The media, which is so used in many cases, uses mediocre sensationalism that does nothing to protect the victim. All of us, we have a key role to play in doing away with violence against women and girls, each one in his own way, in his own possibility, with his own possibilities, with his own influence. As long as they are machistic, misogynist, homophobic societies based on sexist ideals, there will be violence against women. We are together to eliminate any form of violence against women and girls. From union, inequality, miracles appear, and a single voice can have the strength of thousands. Thank you, Portuguese Platform for the Rights of Women, who invited me to be here today, giving voice to somebody who thought she had lost her voice. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada mais uma vez pelos.
Thank you once more for your testimonials. I believe strongly in the power of telling the story in the first person. I think you are the drivers of change. So your courage, your generosity, and your engagement in this fight to tell your own experiences. And if the organizers allow me, I would give the floor immediately to our audience. I'm sure that they have questions for our two speakers. We already have some people asking for the floor.
Boa tarde, eu agradeço.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the two speakers for sharing with us their experiences. I thought I would not ask any questions because I've never had the same experience, but I really felt the urge to ask some questions. I'm a mother of a son and a daughter, and my daughter plays football. But when you said that schools should also do their part, I don't agree. I'm a teacher as well. I'm a maths teacher, and already have to teach maths, and I must also talk about sex literacy, finance, and some parts of citizenship. So I don't think that it should be my responsibility, because I'm preparing the students for a national exam, that I should have this obligation. Civil society also has a role to play. Mothers, I'm a mother. It is also part of our responsibility. And all men have a mother, a sister, a grandmother, a wife, or a daughter. So we can't expect schools to do everything that families don't do. Civil society has also a part to play. As a mother, I have my part to play, but we cannot expect schools to do everything, because there are families who do not agree. It is my responsibility as a teacher to teach. So your question is, please, so if it's not the school, what is the solution? And I guess the question is for Joana.
Cara professora, eu peço desculpa,
não percebi o seu nome.
And your name is? Elisa. Elisa, I think schools have a very important role to play. There's no way around it. You said mothers. It's not only mothers, tutors, fathers, all adults that engage with children. We are responsible, but not all families, for one or other reason, are capable of educating their children. So schools which educate, where our children find their role models, have the responsibility. A teacher, a maths teacher, is not only responsible for teaching maths. You must ensure that there is respect inside the classroom and outside of the classroom. But what I was saying is that in addition to maths, physics, language, there should be a subject called citizenship or emotional citizenship, whatever you want to call it. It does exist in the 5th year, but it only occupies half of the school year. I think there should be one subject throughout the school year where a psychologist or therapists help our children deal with emotions. Of course, civil society cannot dismiss itself, but school has a very important role to play, extremely important. And teachers, as adults who engage with our children, who are the future, must realize this, that teaching maths or science and literature should also teach equality and respect amongst all. It is very difficult to respect our equal, but it's harder to respect someone who is different from us. And I apologize, but it is also the teacher's role as an educator.
Desde logo, porque nem todas as famílias têm as
Above all, because not all families have the skills to educate in the same way. Lena Lopes has a question, I believe. Good afternoon. I'm Lena Lopes. I will not be speaking on behalf of the party, but as Lena, and I'm a teacher as well. Of course, schools are asked to be engaged and have been involved on these topics. Of course, we are the first sometimes to realize that these children have problems. I worked in a school and I had students who in the evening had been beaten. And I realized in the morning that those students were not well. And of course the school had psychologists, etc. The problem is that teachers cannot do everything. Please allow me to finish. Now, you were saying that it is their responsibility. The school has a role to play, an important role to play, because pupils do spend more time sometimes at school than with their families, and that is the problem. And I know many teachers, and we do act as educators, but that is not our role. We should teach and not be educators. The problem is that when sometimes we see that these children have problems, we call the parents. And earlier, someone was saying, and why not educate the parents? Because often it is the parents' problem. I'm also a mother. But I would like to hear you say something. The problem of violence is a problem of justice. And you said that you went to the police and you had a policeman before you to report what had happened. And I know there are now police stations with women. In Sant Antonio, for example, the parish has a police station that is specialized in violence. And I've noticed this in our national parliament. It is not women who are victims of violence that should leave their homes. It is the men. Otherwise, they will be doubly penalized. So I understand exactly what you meant. All of us have cases. I had a very complicated case some time ago, and I went to the police station with my now husband. My husband was parking the car, and you can't imagine how I was treated. It was night, and of course, Lina Nalobj was strong and had somebody next by my side. But they treated me so badly, you can't imagine. And I acted, and I managed to close that police station, and things changed. I'm not going to say where this was, but they treated me as if I were the problem. I was a woman coming in a police station at night, so I was clearly, in their mind, a woman of the night. But I did this for me, for all women, for my daughter, and for men as well, because this is also a problem of men, increasingly. In the National Assembly, we will be discussing domestic violence. It is an area that we will be addressing in our national parliament, not only in our committee, but also the Committee for Population and Development. So please count on me. Actually, if you could, I would like you to speak in our committee, because domestic violence is an educational problem, and school has a role to play. There is the subject, citizenship, that indeed is important. There are some people who are against it. It's not only teachers. It's not only teachers already do a lot. But also we must act in justice. Magistrates already receive training at the School for Magistrates, and there are also now equality plans in the police station. So something is being done, and politicians are also paying attention. And we are human. We are human as well. We also have our own problems. I am only here representing my profession, but I would like you to speak in our committee. I'm no longer the president, but I'm going to suggest that you speak in our committee. Thank you very much.
Não sei se há mais alguma questão.
Are there any more questions? Just one more. My question for Joanna is, but she has answered already. Did you feel that you were not supported by the community? Police also has a political participation, but, and I'd like to ask Joanna, don't you feel that the experience of the survivors is not taken on board? If we had somebody from the justice system, they would say that, you know, they already have extra work, and then we have the teachers who are saying that justice, that they can't do everything. Don't you feel that everybody, the problem is always pushed around from professionals to professionals? Well, violence against women and girls is violence in general against people. We are talking about women and girls because there are also men who are victims of domestic violence. It's really very difficult to solve. It's natural that there should be these problems, but it depends on the entire civil society, politics, education, the media. But it's something really difficult. There has to be a very deep union. When we think about the vices of society, which is sexist and homophobic, and we're speaking about men and many women too, who are on this side. If we think that all other people are many more than these, I ask myself, how can we not make our voice be stronger than the voice of the other group. And I think it's because we are very much split, and we have to come together, education and justice and the law enforcement agencies. We have to have links with the various associations and NGOs so that our voice, which is a weaker voice, should show the strength that it has indeed. And we cannot quit. I'm a mother. I have a kid in school. When I go to schools and speak about school issues, I know what I'm talking about. I'm the daughter of a teacher. I saw my mother working really hard, and I know that my mother was a teacher, and she didn't quit her educational role, because what happens in schools, you have education. And education is not only on cognitive intelligence, it's also emotional intelligence. And I know how overworked teachers are. So there has to be more people working in schools other than the teachers who do so much that should ensure the emotional intelligence of our children. Thank you so much. One more question, just really quickly. Really quickly, please be very brief so that we can have the reply to close this round of questions. Hello, I'm Margarida Medina Martins. I'm from the Association of Women Against Violence. I'm just going to share something with you. Violence is something you learn. This is not an opinion. This comes from research. The challenge of the United Nations over the past 50 years is to see how you can break generational violence. Boys learn male behaviors and girls learn the so-called survival values. So this has been written in the United Nations ever since it existed. Nowadays, we cannot deal with these issues in the same way as we did before, because we had a pandemic, and with the pandemic we had confinement, and with the lockdowns there was an explosion of violence against women in unimaginable ways, and sexual abuse of children in a really frightening way, often using the internet, viewing pornographic videos. The average age of children going into watching pornographic movies is 11 years old. I've been working in domestic violence for many years, and what we learned is that the aggressors drop the strategy to groom the victims, the grooming strategies, where they're going to hit, how they're going to hit, at what time. They design the whole thing. And we have aggressors who take 16 years to set up a strategy to sexually abuse a child who hasn't yet been born, a girl who is yet unborn. So we can't put in the schools this responsibility. Schools face a sort of atomic bomb because the children have in school a non-violent space, and that's where they will explode in view of everything that happened during the pandemic. And we see this happening already. Even I'm sorry, but you really have to wind up. So sexual abuse is a pandemic in Portuguese society and in other societies. So basically, schools are part of this journey, but we have to deal with this in general terms, and once and for all, human rights must be the reference point in all areas of Portuguese society. We cannot have human rights that are recognized in one place and not be recognized in other areas like health. Human rights are with us from the moment we are born until the moment we die. Thank you. Joana, would you like to say something? Would you like to say something? Alexandra? Ana Sofia. Well, thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Alexandra Silva. Thank you to you all and to Maria João, Joana and Mia. I'd just like to pay tribute to Joana and to Mia because you have to be very courageous to speak in public. This is being streamed, it's being recorded, and it will remain forever, and it's really very difficult for you to share your personal history. We all have personal histories and we don't usually tell it, and they were courageous enough to tell their story, and that's really important. And I'd like to pay tribute to Mia and Joana for being so courageous. Thank you. The lady is speaking without a microphone, so we have no sound in the booth. We cannot interpret.
Portanto, Praça do Comércio.
Now we go to the Praça do Comércio at 6:30. You will see clear signs of the demonstration starting at 6:30 in Praça do Comércio, which is right next door. Thank you.